In this lecture, we're going to be discussing governance, regulation, and related policy issues. These impinge more and more on the security engineer's life, and indeed on people who are delivering and developing and designing IT systems in general, because more and more of our societal functions are supported by IT in ways that matter and which change the rules of society. So first of all, let's think about the technology cycle to put things in perspective. Historically, a whole lot of transformative technologies have come along: steam, steel, electricity, radios, cars, oil, and they all followed a similar pattern. First of all, you've got groundbreaking investment in new technology. People invent the better steam engines, blast furnaces, the electric dynamo, AC currents, and so on. And this new technology leads to a speculative frenzy as dozens and dozens of firms jump into an evolving market. Then you've got consolidation and correction, and a few large dominant firms appear, and then you've got governments coming in with regulation to ensure safety and to correct market power. For example, when the railways attracted huge amounts of investment during the 19th century, that changed the world, but pretty soon the railway owners could extract a huge amount of value from the underlying economy. And so all over the world, people had to regulate railways. And we're now getting to that point for the internet and the online industries. And of course, where we're heading is the steady state, or more or less steady state, of a mature industry that settles down and then may in turn be disrupted by other technologies later on. Now, this same cycle holds not just for macro scale industries, but also at smaller, faster scales for component technologies around CPUs, for example, or disk drives or whatever. So what does governance look like? Well, the answer is it's complex. You've got global and local public goods, which we discussed in the economics lecture. There's then things like safety and security certification. How do you know that a product that you buy is sufficiently secure or sufficiently safe, and what does it even mean? Then there's consumer protection. How do you stop firms being ripped off by unscrupulous vendors, particularly once commerce is globalized and people can just as easily go and buy goods from a website in Brazil or India or China as one from down the road? And once you've set up regulators of one kind or another, whether tech regulators or banking regulators or whatever, then there's the risk that these regulators become captured, that the banks go and lobby the banking regulator and end up having it staffed by people who see the world through their particular lens. And this in turn leads to competition policy and antitrust. If Britain is suffering because we've only got 5 big banks, then what do you do about that? What sort of things do you do to break up the existing banks you've got, to prevent mergers between banks that would make the situation worse, or to change the rules so that you encourage the growth of new challenger fintechs? This then leads us on to the broader question of how do you defend democracy? If our electoral mechanisms are under threat from fake news and people breaking our laws around election advertising by buying election ads from overseas, then what can we do about that? A related issue is how do you protect the vulnerable? Because if voters are vulnerable to being manipulated by bad actors overseas, then there are many people in society who are more vulnerable than just the average person exercising their function as a voter. And what about children? What about seniors, people who may be facing the onset of dementia? What about people who are going through troublesome life transitions? What about people in the throes of a family breakup, or people changing gender, for example? And this then brings us on to one of the perpetual hard problems in our field, namely privacy versus surveillance. So let's start with public goods, which we already discussed in the lecture on economics. Now, public goods are defined as goods which are non-rival and non-excludable, so you can't stop other people enjoying the same goods, and everybody can enjoy them at the same time. And the usual examples that economics textbooks talk about are national defense and clean air. But technology is changing these, because more and more that public goods are becoming global rather than local. An example is clean air. Back when I was a lad in the 1960s, the issue was clean air as stopping people burning coal in their grates in cities. Because if you had everybody in London or everybody in Glasgow burning coal to heat their houses, you got smog. On winter nights when there was fog, then the coal smoke would go into the fog and people would get bronchitis and pneumonia and they would die. So we passed laws stopping people burning coal in their grates. They had to burn coke or move to gas-fired boilers. And now, of course, the issue is limiting CO2 emissions because we realize that the CO2 is a global problem. It's causing sea levels to rise and weather to become more adverse worldwide. Now, the effect of technology is not just to bring us bad things like coal-fired power stations. It adds an awful lot more and more complex and more interrelated public goods that people care about. For example, we all want a dependable internet, and that means not just having stable backbone and routing architecture, it means having dependable local networks too, whether that means our university network or whether that means the DSL network by the local provider where you live. Now, having a dependable internet and local networks means having tolerable levels of cybercrime and abuse, and that is becoming globalized because the bad guys can be sitting in Brasilia or in St. Petersburg. Then another bundle of public goods is around security standards and related safety standards. If you go and buy a car that's got some automatic capability, even if not full self-driving, maybe it can kind of drive itself on the motorway, how do you know that's safe? How do you know it's secure? How do you know it's not going to be possible someday for some bad person to seize control of your car remotely and drive it into some pedestrians as part of some terrorist act, leaving you in the midst of carnage? And if you're going to impose safety and security standards on business worldwide, there are issues around trust in commerce and trust in the governance mechanisms themselves, because of course greedy actors will try and subvert the governance mechanisms for their own purposes and have things certified as safe and secure when in fact they're not. So let's start by looking at security standards, because that's the core theme of this particular course. Now, if we go back to the 20th century, in the 1980s, the US government came up with the Orange Book, as it was called, the Trusted Computing Systems Evaluation Criteria. And their concern was to evaluate multi-level secure systems for sale to initially the US government and also to NATO governments. And the evaluation was done in the way that seemed obvious to them at the time. They had US civil servants who worked for the National Security Agency who would get a computer system that someone wanted to sell to the US government, and they'd sit down and study it. And they would typically take a year or 2 or even 3 years, and they'd go through it in great detail. They'd comb through the operating system one line at a time. They'd look for all the buffer overflows and all the other things that could be used to elevate privilege or launch attacks from the outside, and they would insist that they got fixed. Now, this was careful and thorough, but the problem is it took forever because civil servants are risk averse and they had all the time in the world. And so government systems were always about a generation out of date. And so few of them were bought that they were unreasonably expensive. And the customers in the Department of Defense in America and worldwide were forever champing at the bits to buy modern commercial computer systems simply so that they could get their work done. That was replaced in the 1990s by the Common Criteria, which evolved from a separate system that we had along with the French, the Germans, and the Dutch, which was called ITSEC. And the idea there was that you're more flexible. You don't assume that the product that you're evaluating has to just do multi-level security. So you're allowed to write a suitable protection profile and then evaluate the equipment to that. And it's often a two-phase process whereby you first of all get your protection profile approved and then a piece of equipment approved that is then certified to conform to it. And this still matters today because it's a big deal for smart cards, for hardware security modules, and for other kit. for things like banking and ID management and electronic signature, the sort of things that deal with ID cards in airports and which enable you to use ID cards in some countries to sign documents with, these all end up being common criteria evaluated. Now, rather than having all the evaluations done by civil servants, the scheme is that a number of labs in each participating country are licensed as commercial licensed evaluation facilities, or CLEFs, and the CLEFs are regulated by the national agency, which in Britain is GCHQ. Now, this gives much more flexibility than the American system from the last century. The Americans have now adopted it too. It's faster, it's cheaper, but it's got a very pervasive failure mode, which is that equipment vendors shop around for the cheapest deal. And that typically is some evaluation lab in Eastern Europe. And so long as Britain was in the European Union, we were duty bound to recognise evaluations made anywhere in the Union. Now, ITSEC and common criteria, as it's called now, aren't the only compliance regimes. There's another set of compliance regimes that you'll come across in your professional work, the ISO 27000 series of standards. And these basically set out processes for documenting your security management techniques in a company. And they're basically run by the big four audit companies. Now, what this compliance means is that you get somebody along from your auditors who's got on his laptop a list of several hundred questions that he asks every customer who goes through ISO 27000. And he goes through this list of questions with you. Once you can tick enough boxes, you get signed off. That's the most widespread system for security certification for general commercial companies, but there are other systems which are used in particular sectors. Healthcare systems often have HIPAA compliance, that's the Healthcare Insurance Portability and Accountability Act in America, which is the US healthcare IT regulation regime. And that's usually something that you get on a healthcare kit you buy in Britain because it's also sold in America. You may also hear of the Sarbanes-Oxley requirements, which fall on companies quoted on the US stock market. And every country now has its system of financial regulation, and in Britain that's the Financial Conduct Authority, which looks for after banks and firms offering credit, and firms that offer payments like fintechs have that delegated by the FCA to the Payment Services Regulator. Now, this involves everything from crypto and resilience standards to anti-money laundering and know your customer duties. As we remarked in the lecture on banking, these impose a fairly heavy compliance burden without actually stopping the bad guys doing their thing. So many of these compliance regimes end up being seen as a regulatory burden, as a red tape that business complains about and that wants to be cut. The latest regulatory good idea that's already becoming a burden is Cyber Essentials from GCHQ. Now, this was spawned by GCHQ after Brexit because of their frustration with the easy common criteria evaluations that people would get from formerly communist countries. And so insecure equipment was marketed as secure equipment, and there was nothing GCHQ could do about it. They were also frustrated with the auditor-driven processes like ISO 27000, because pretty well every big firm in Britain that has been hacked was ISO 27000 certified. And what basically happened was that the auditor said, "Have you got X?" And they answered yes, not realizing this was false. So the auditor ticked the box and they got the certification. So Cyber Essentials aims to provide a minimum baseline for government suppliers, and it's rapidly become something that lots and lots of companies want. And yet it's already causing problems. At the university, for example, an issue is that Cyber Essentials says that we have to certify that all the devices on the network are patched up to date. Now, that includes the devices that you bring yourself if we allow user-supplied devices on the network. One of the things about Cyber Essentials is that it says every device on the network should have a service expiry date, that is, a date up to which the vendor undertakes to patch it. And Apple doesn't do this. Apple doesn't give any undertakings about how much support there will be for your iPhone or your iPad or your MacBook. And therefore, in theory, the university shouldn't allow anybody to use an Apple device on a network. Now, if this was a commercial company, the CEO would just say, look, don't be stupid. Just say that all devices are patched and tick that box and get on with it. But universities tend to be cautious and bureaucratic, and university administrators don't like to say that things are true when they aren't. So that's an example of how the red tape can very quickly catch up with you. So what might we learn from looking at the evolution of security standards over the last 40 years? Well, basically what happened is that security standard setting started off in the US military, and then everybody grabbed a share of it until it didn't work anymore. So just as software becomes ever more complex with featureitis until it breaks, the same kind of thing has happened with security standards. Now, there are more general failure mechanisms, which we discussed in the economics lecture under the heading of public choice, in that people's own interests aren't the same as their employers, and the firm's objectives aren't the same as society's. So all the way up and down the stack, people are optimizing for local benefit rather than for the public goods that we would like the system overall to produce. And we use laws to fix this, but of course laws are made by legislators who are human. They take bribes, they meet lobbyists, they get nice lunches, they hope to get non-executive directorships once their job as a minister expires. And all these mechanisms come together to enable powerful organizations to lobby in order to change the rules in their favor. Now, this is known as regulatory capture, and there's a huge literature on this. There are hundreds and hundreds of economists who spend their lives studying regulatory capture. And the takeaway message is that regulators very often end up being run by their industries, because that's where the expertise is. Examples that I've come across in my own working life include the Financial Conduct Authority, which is supposed to regulate banks, but the only people at the FCA who actually understand how banks work are people who were working at a bank 2 or 3 years ago and expect to be working at another bank in 2 or 3 years' time. And so the FCA is suffused with banker culture, and there's nobody there who's prepared to challenge the assumptions that the big banks make about their customers, for example, and about how business should be done. Another example is the MHRA, the Medicines and Healthcare Devices Regulatory Authority, which not only looks after medical safety, but medical device safety. And when we have lobbied the MHRA about the safety of medical devices, you end up finding that the MHRA's non-executive directors tend to be retired scientists from drug companies and medical device makers. I once even spoke to the civil servant who advised the Secretary of State for Health on how to go about hiring non-executive directors for the MHRA, and I suggested that they appoint a distinguished academic who'd studied medical device failure. Oh no, said the civil servant. Ministers would never do that. The drug companies would complain like mad. Fortunately, in the USA, we have seen a prominent academic who studies medical device safety being appointed to the FDA, the American equivalent. So regulatory capture doesn't work all the time, but it happens enough of the time in enough countries to be a real problem. Another issue is that sometimes politicians design regulators to be weak. My classic case here is the Information Commissioner's Office, because when its predecessor was set up under Margaret Thatcher's government in the 1980s, the then Home Secretary told everybody who'd listen that, Margaret Thatcher doesn't really believe in this data privacy thing, he said. It's a German idea like ID cards. We've got to do some of it to keep the bloody Euros happy, but don't worry, I'll see to it that it doesn't cause any trouble. And so the Privacy Commissioner was stuck in darkest Cheshire and not allowed to hire any techie people and not given any real powers to enforce privacy rules against business. And the office was also given a dual role in that it advises government departments on privacy, and it's also the privacy rule enforcer. And so it can't very well enforce privacy rules against government departments because it approved those rules itself with its other hat on. This is the sort of trick that is used to make regulators weak. And sometimes there's arbitrage, by which one means competition between states or between agencies to make things weak. And the classic case here is Ireland's equivalent, their Data Protection Commissioner. Now, it has been the policy of the government of Ireland for the past 40 years to make Ireland the most attractive place for American companies to set up their headquarters in the European Union. So they deliberately see to it that their rate of corporation tax is lower than anywhere else in Europe. So if you're Google or Microsoft or Apple, it's logical for you to have your European headquarters in Dublin. And they also went to even more extreme lengths than the UK government in depriving the Irish Data Protection Commissioner of powers and seeing to it that everybody who was appointed to the job was solidly pro-tech. And so this is one of the big flashpoints in Europe that people are forever complaining that the law isn't enforced against the likes of Facebook, but within the EU, enforcing privacy law against Facebook is the job of the Irish Data Protection Commissioner, because Dublin is where Facebook has its headquarters. And the Data Protection Commissioner leans over backwards to not do anything that might upset Facebook. Now, so far so normal. That's just how people behave in institutions, how institutions get formed, how companies compete with each other, and how countries compete with each other. And very often it's a race to the bottom. But sometimes there's deception as well, because security standards have often been set with backdoors for intelligence service access. The classic case of this was the dual EC random number generator, which the US National Institute of Standards and Technology standardized at the request of the US National Security Agency. And lots of pieces of software and even hardware devices such as routers used this random number generator, and the effect of it was that if you used this to generate keys, then the NSA could figure out what those keys were. So this brings us on to competition policy. Again and again, over the past couple of hundred years, some companies have become so rich and so powerful that legislative action was taken to rein them in, to break them up, to limit their power. Famous cases were railway regulation during the 19th century and the regulation of the oil industry in the early 20th century, which involved breaking up the largest oil company at the time, Rockefeller's Standard Oil. Now, monopolies have come and gone in our industry too over the years, and in fact, the first big monopolist in information technology was NCR, the National Cash Register of Dayton, Ohio, which had a monopoly in late Victorian times on the use of punch card tabulating machines. And they were prosecuted, just like Standard Oil, in the early years of the 20th century by the US administration. And it was only once that case was settled that IBM spun off. Its founder, Tom Watson, had been NCR's sales manager for New York, and so he knew all the CEOs of the banks who were NCR's most lucrative customers. IBM, in turn, got sued by the US government in a huge antitrust case in the late 1970s, and that gave Microsoft its chance because IBM was not prepared to be as aggressive as it had usually been when it launched its personal computer, and this enabled Bill Gates to get in there as the software supplier. Microsoft then only had a dozen or so employees, and their decision to license his operating system basically destroyed their fortune and made his. Then later on, Microsoft got hammered by an antitrust lawsuit under the Clinton administration. And in the late 1990s, this was what completely tied up Microsoft's executives' time and attention, enabling Google to get started. And so it goes. And so every so often, we've got antitrust action against the leaders in the tech world. And at the moment, Google and Facebook are facing that, both in America and in the European Union. And we now see that TikTok is beating Google as the leading online destination. This started happening in December 2021. And so perhaps we're going to see the same cycle being repeated again. In fact, my own thesis advisor, the late Roger Needham, once remarked on this, having been decades at Cambridge and then for a while at Microsoft as an executive, that the wheel of birth, death, and resurrection just turns a little bit faster in the tech industry than elsewhere. So what's the state of play in competition policy in tech? Well, in America and the UK, we largely abandoned antitrust enforcement from the late 1980s because the governments of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher decided that the world had become too statist and stuffy, and it was time to open the world up to the bracing winds of competition. And along came a lawyer called Robert Burke, who advanced a theory of competition law, saying that competition law should only act against a company if the consumers ended up worse off. In other words, if the consumer surplus was decreased by anti-competitive action, the law should spring into action and do something. But if consumers ended up better off, then the law should just let competition take its course. And this made it very, very difficult for competition authorities to take action against companies such as Google and Facebook, because after all, their products are free, at least to the end user. Of course, where the anti-competitive aspects arise is in the way they treat advertisers. The view on that has since changed because new economic and legal scholars of competition policy have pointed out that the damage done in terms of innovation elsewhere in the ecosystem that's foregone because of the way that Google and Facebook monopolize the advertising industry, on which so much online stuff depends, is such that there is a strong case for antitrust action. And people are now starting to pay attention to this. The European Union has always paid attention to it. European law has never gone in for the consumer surplus test. It has always taken the view that you commit an offence if you use market power in one industry in order to acquire it in another. So if you use market power in search, for example, to build up a travel agency that can beat up all the other travel agencies, then that's a bad thing. And there have been all sorts of cases against Google and Facebook because they have favoured companies or business operations within their own stable. It's also worth pointing out that monopoly is not just about technology, because the changing legal climate over the past 30 years has encouraged all sorts of other industries to become concentrated. And so if you speak to any farmers, for example, you'll hear them complain that they can't make enough money from selling their lambs at market anymore. And yet when you go to the supermarket, you see that lamb chops are expensive, and they're certainly much more expensive in relative terms than they were when I was a kid. And what's happening, of course, is that you've got concentration among meat packers and among supermarkets. So monopoly is not just about tech, and if you want to read all about this, then I'd recommend that you read Matt Stoller's blog, because he's an economist who keeps up to date with this and is tied in with the new antitrust people who are starting to get into power under President Biden in the USA. So this is an area that really matters to tech, and I expect it to change significantly over the next 10 years as competition policy revives and acquires teeth again, both in America and in the USA. In fact, even China is using competition policy as an excuse to beat back various big tech companies in order to make sure that they don't challenge the Communist Party of China's leading position in society. But in our democracies, there are other issues around tech. There have been all sorts of studies of the extent to which fake news and the techniques that are used to whip up online hate mobs have been used to undermine democracy. They were used, for example, to influence the Brexit referendum in the UK in 2016. Later that year, the presidential election that brought Donald Trump to office. And since then, we have seen a number of countries becoming less democratic, from India to Brazil, in ways that are associated with online mobs whipped up by incumbents in order to intimidate the opposition and see to it that the opposition don't have an online platform. These are often allied with more traditional kinds of political shenanigans, such as getting businessmen that you know to buy up all the newspapers. But nonetheless, there are significant threats to democracy coming through online vectors. So one of the things that countries are now doing is to pass laws which tiptoe around the edge of censorship and which demand content moderation. The UK Online Safety Bill, currently going through Parliament, would require online service providers to censor some types of speech that are not actually illegal to make if you get a soapbox at Hyde Park Corner and say those things there. And this raises many interesting questions. For example, there are privacy issues. What sort of things should Facebook look at? Where should it turn the searchlight of its AI techniques and its content moderators? And what sort of things should it try and exclude? At present, Facebook excludes things that are illegal, such as child sex abuse images and terrorism, and some things that many people find in bad taste and offensive, such as animal cruelty, and some things that Facebook has decided that it's going to censor for its own reasons, such as nudity. Facebook doesn't allow female nipples, for example, but it does allow male nipples. And this has led to some interesting demonstrations in New York, where people have walked through the streets without their shirts on, with the men having pictures of female nipples taped to their nipples, and the women having pictures of male nipples taped to their nipples. So while people can have an interesting debate about that, there are real issues about how this is done at scale when it comes to stuff that's at the borderline of political sensitivity. One man's hate speech is another man's free speech, and so on. And then there are competition issues. If something like the Online Safety Bill is going to require Facebook to hire another 15,000 moderators, then Facebook can certainly afford that. And it's got the organizational resources to go and hire them in the Philippines, where they'll only earn a couple of dollars a day. But what about a startup? A startup can't do that kind of thing. And therefore, this kind of regulation may give some benefits in terms of defending democracy or preventing online offense, but it's likely to make competition issues even harder. And then there are broader effects of legislating for mandatory content filters. Suppose, for example, you demand that Facebook should be able to prevent hate speech much better than it does at present. How will such mechanisms end up being used in less democratic countries? Now, I should mention at this point that at present, the AI systems that we have for detecting and removing hate speech aren't really all that good because, many apparently offensive things are sometimes said in jest or by opponents of the people who normally say those things, or the things that people are quoting. And although humans can disentangle this stuff, it's very, very difficult for AIs to. And so the best estimates we have at the moment is that Facebook manages to block about a quarter of the hate speech on its platform in English, but only about 2% of the content in Arabic. And so there are significant technical problems here, as well as significant policy problems. The technical problems will no doubt be tackled a bit over time, but there's a hard core of really, really difficult stuff here, where you're going to need human moderators to decide the edge cases. A related issue is protecting the more vulnerable. Now, if you consider all voters to be vulnerable to hate speech and want to protect them a bit, then you certainly want to protect more vulnerable people, or you want to protect people against more harmful things like financial fraud and phishing and so on. Now, one of the things that I mentioned in the banking lectures is that banks have for years been trying to blame customers for fraud, and the losers tend to be more poor and more female and more black than the average bank customer. We've seen quite a number of such cases over the years, and if you're white and well off and middle class and you know how to complain, you may often be able to get your money back from the bank. Otherwise, good luck. So is there a role for more vigorous regulation here to make things fairer? I've always believed that there is, and thankfully in the last couple of years the Payment Services Regulator has been starting to step up to the plate and insisting that banks make fraud victims good. So far only the TSB is doing that in the majority of cases, so this is an interesting fight and a socially important one and worth watching. A second bundle of issues is around the security theatre that we have in banking, the know your customer, the idea that for anybody to have an unrestricted bank account, they have to produce government issue photo ID and 2 proofs of address. This is basically an American rule which was introduced by the US Department of the Treasury after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and it was done as their contribution to the war on terror. But it has had all sorts of bad effects worldwide. It is the main barrier to financial inclusion in the third world, because if you're a Maasai herdsman whose house consists of 4 pieces of wood on the back of your cow, you don't have a proof of address because you have no address. And if you're limited for all of your life to using a bank account that can only have $100 in it, then that is a significant extra handicap. Here in more developed countries, the burden of the Know Your Customer regulations tends to follow on people making transitions, people who are escaping a violent partner, people who are changing gender, and people who are recently bereaved. When my mum died, my dad had to spend something like a year sorting out all the accounts and getting control of them because of all the requirement for proofs and one thing and another. It is something similar if you go through a divorce, and it's even worse if you break up from a violent partner who's not going to be at all collaborative in sorting the mess out. There's also an assumption of mental capacity which disadvantages the elderly and children. We sometimes see this when older people start sliding into the beginnings of dementia and they're not quite at the point that somebody will take over for them. The difficulty of dealing with all this theatre around banks and identity and so on can be really disabling. So how can you go about protecting kids and seniors if you're doing it from their point of view? The answer is it's difficult. The first things that policymakers did to try and protect kids involved talking about child protection online, and the Budapest Convention in 2004 prohibited child sex abuse material. So if you're under 18, then you're not allowed to put nude photographs of yourself online or send them to anybody else. If you're 16, if you send a nude photograph of yourself to your girlfriend or boyfriend, then both of you can go to jail for it. Now, of course, this is ridiculous given how people behave, but that's the law, and it's an example of how well-meaning attempts to protect people can end up causing problems and putting vulnerable people in harm's way. When it comes to actually protecting children, one of the things that happened in 2021 was that Baroness Beban-Kidron pushed through the Age-Appropriate Design Code, which has been enforced since the middle of 2021 and is now in its 1-year implementation period. From the middle of 2022, this is going to be enforced by the Information Commissioner's Office. And it basically insists that if your customers or your users are under 18, then you should respect their privacy in all of the ways that are not actually enforced if your users are adults. So you have to provide a high level of privacy for under 18s by design and default, and that means that you can't share location by default. You have to make location and other privacy settings obvious. You mustn't nudge children to make harmful choices. Unlike the typical website which nudges you to accept this and approve that and share your information with the advertisers and so on. You mustn't auto-recommend harmful stuff, and you have to turn off behavioral advertising. That's only the beginning of it. There's a whole list of other things too. And well, you might say, why isn't this rule enforced for all ages? Why is it only going to be enforced for under 18s? Well, that's an interesting question. See what we discussed above about regulatory capture and the power of large corporates, but at least it's a start. And the good news is that large companies with international operations like Google and Facebook and Apple now appear to be implementing the age-appropriate design code worldwide, because it's simpler just to have one set of software that runs everywhere rather than having a separate set of software for use in the UK. So that this at least is one piece of good news in a world where the news on the privacy front is generally pretty dire. However, child protection talk is often used to justify quite different policy goals. And the back history of this is that going right back to the 1990s, the intelligence and law enforcement agencies have been using claims about protecting kids or stopping terrorists to justify continual increases in their powers of surveillance. My first engagement with this was in the early 1990s, during what was called Crypto War I, when US and UK governments tried to limit strong cryptography. The Clinton administration, as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, brought in the Clipper chip, which had an NSA backdoor key in it, and they wanted everybody to use cryptography that the US government could also decrypt. That turned out to have a vulnerability in it and was laughed off the stage. But next, the governments tried to limit cryptographic key length, and to this day, an awful lot of crypto is weak. MyFair Classic, for example, is the most commonly used contactless smart card. It's used in building entry controls in hundreds of thousands of buildings worldwide, from university buildings to hotels. And because its key length is only 48 bits, it's possible for a knowledgeable person with a card reader and a PC to clone any card that they can get in their possession just for a few seconds. And as a result, all sorts of buildings are insecure, and all sorts of business models around things like hotel locks and so on have had to be redone. We also find lots of software with protocol vulnerabilities, as with Bluetooth, which has got dozens of vulnerabilities, many of them unpatched in many devices, or certification issues, as with TLS, the fact that most of the world's governments have got rogue CAs, and if you don't use certificate pinning, you're going to be vulnerable to man-in-the-middle attacks. The most recent bundle of problems came to the fore in June 2020, when the European Union announced that it would demand that end-to-end encrypted apps such as WhatsApps should incorporate client-side scanning. In other words, the WhatsApp software on your mobile phone was supposed to look at every photograph that you sent or received to make sure that it didn't contain child sex abuse images. And they also wanted it to scan videos, which is too complex a computational task to do on your phone. It would have to be done on a server. And they also wanted text to be scanned in case you were grooming kids for sex or trying to recruit people for terrorist activities. And again, doing NLP models of any complexity is something for which you need servers rather than just keyword spotting on a phone. So this basically put the privacy and tech communities on notice that we were in for another round of crypto wars, and in August 2021, Apple announced a design. Now, content scanning systems have been around for over a decade. In France and Germany, it's against the law to put Nazi material online, and you get big fines if you do. So firms like Google will scan all YouTube videos to see if they contain any swastikas, and if they do, then they can't be shown in France or Germany. The European Union has followed up with its terror regulation, which says that material that glorifies terrorism has got to be taken down very quickly in response to demand. And again, the service companies like YouTube can face absolutely enormous fines if they don't do that. There are scanning systems which look for child sex abuse material, because the Budapest Convention makes that illegal almost everywhere. And as I mentioned, there are other systems that people use to look for spam, for animal cruelty, and for nudity. Now, the scanning is usually done on provider servers with some mix of human moderators and technology. In the case of still images, people tend to use something called perceptual hashing, which provides a rough hash of an image which gives the same answer for similar images. And there's various ways of doing this. A perceptual hash could just be a 32 by 32 grayscale thumbnail, which is what Microsoft does. Apple's got something a bit more fancy with neural networky stuff. You can go and look online about how it works. For things like NLP and videos, you really have to use machine learning if you're going to get a reasonable trade-off between false alarms and missed alarms. And the false alarm rate is the limiting thing here, because if you're looking at a system like WhatsApp, which is dealing with over 10 billion messages a day, if you've got even a 0.1% false alarm rate, you'll be completely swamped in false alarms. So how do you go about training your filter models or building target lists for perceptual hashing? Well, the answer is that you have moderators. And you've got lots and lots of moderators. Facebook's got about 15,000, and a recent audit suggested they should actually have twice as many if they were to do effectively even what they say they're trying to do. And this isn't very effective. Facebook is about 25% of hate speech in English, but only 2% in Arabic. And of course, it's expensive. There was one disclosure that Facebook had paid one contractor alone $500 million last year for doing content scanning. So if you think of a content scanning system, who can possibly abuse that? Well, the first thing is that authorised parties could abuse it. And an example here is the Australian police, who raided some journalists who had published photographs of Australian SAS soldiers killing civilians in Afghanistan. Governments can, if they will, use content scanning techniques to censor stuff that embarrasses or offends them. Then you've got scope creep, because if you've got a filter which looks for child abuse, then the natural thing to do would be to add face recognition so that you can see missing children too. The big agency in America, which looks for and curates child sex abuse material, NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, does missing children as well as exploited children. So this would be a natural thing for them to ask for. And once you've got face recognition so that you can spot missing kids, then the natural thing is to look for dissidents or for people that you don't want your citizens to be carrying around pictures of. If you're the government of China, you probably want to scan for those citizens who have got pictures of the Dalai Lama or of the Pope or whatever. The next part of your threat model is what about abuse by unauthorized second parties, by which we mean corrupt police or tech company insiders. Because remember, the tech company insiders are reporting to the police, so they're part of the enforcement chain here. And of course, they're open to abuse. This is just one of those things that happens when you have got millions of police worldwide. Some of them will be on the take, even in those countries where the police aren't manifestly obeying orders of the local despot. Then you're going to have abuse by unauthorized third parties, such as foreign states and criminals. And then there will be local adversaries, such as your partner, your ex-partner, your personal rival, or perhaps even your parents. If you're a gay kid who hasn't come out yet, then you may be very concerned about what your parents may or may not see about the kind of nude images you're looking at on your phone. So there's all sorts of threats, both state level and personal level, insiders, outsiders, and somewhere in between. The next question is, if you're going to have a scanner on your phone, then where is it going to be? Well, if the scanning is done in the WhatsApp app, then you could just use Signal instead. If it's in the device operating system, if it's in Android or iOS, then the attacker gets everything. Among other things, the attacker would be able to get your Google Master cookie, which is used to log on to Gmail, and so they're able to go onto your Gmail and download all of that and all of the other data that you keep as other online services. And this is known as cloud forensics, and it's a big, big growth industry among the police. Police Scotland has done an ethics review and has limited the circumstances in which they will do cloud forensics from captured phones. But most police forces, even in England, don't restrain themselves in this way. And so far, the mainstream statute law doesn't have anything particular to say about it. The third possibility for location of the scanner is in device middleware. Now, in Apple's proposal, they were going to use the backup mechanism for the iOS camera roll, so that whenever a photo in your iPhone was backed up to the iCloud, it would basically be checked out to see whether it contained a child sex abuse image. Now, here an opt-out may be possible in theory, but it's hard in practice because Apple nudges you all the time to use iCloud as a backup. And of course, the fourth possibility is you still keep it at the server, that you just go to the server whenever anybody puts any stuff on their phone and you check it out, because then you can run your big NLP models to check out the video in NLP. And then you're just using the mechanisms that we already have. So the Apple offer in August 2021 was to scan all the photos when uploaded from the iPhone's camera roll to backup in the iCloud. And it used a perpetual hashing technique called neural hash, which checks every single photo that you take or that you import from another app against a block list of 200,000 historical child sex abuse images. And as soon as you uploaded 30 photos that were on the block list, then fancy cryptography would enable them to be decrypted. This was a really cool device called private set intersection. And the upshot is that once you had uploaded 30 photos on the list, then those 30 photos could be decrypted, but not any of the other photos on your phone. So it was as privacy preserving as Apple's engineers could make it. And then Apple staff and contractors would review the photos for possible false alarms and report real abuse images to authority. So when this came out, there was an explosion of outrage online. Firstly, there are general issues. What happens when you move scanning to the client? Well, firstly, you get access to stored data, not just communications. Second, you reveal content other than legitimate targets to both authorized and unauthorized abusers. Third, you reveal content to local adversaries, everybody from your boss to your parents. Fourth, you enable reverse engineering of targeted materials such as reversible hashes or machine learning models training data. And in the case of illegal stuff such as child sex abuse images, this places severe constraints on what you can actually do in terms of hashes that you can use and ML models that are potentially acceptable. But worst of all, attackers can experiment to approve attacks. And then, of course, there's the general point that more software is going to lead to more vulnerabilities. So what does this mean in practice? It means that evasion attacks on perpetual hashes get easier because it's easy to take an image and tweak it and see if it fires off the perceptual hash or not. And within a few days of the Apple announcement, people had dug out the neural hash software from their existing iPhones, and they had found out how to do second pre-image attacks on them. In other words, how to tweak an innocuous image, such as a photo of a professor's face, so that it looked just like a wicked image of child sex abuse. And this would mean that you could upload a picture to the web that looked like my picture, and it would set off the alarm whenever anybody looked at it, saying this is a wicked image, call the police. All sorts of trickery was possible like that. Another thing is that you can use adversarial machine learning attacks on the underlying ML models for evasion, poisoning, and backdooring, so that the police, for example, in China, could do covert population-wide search for photos of bin Laden or Dalai Lama or the Pope. Whatever photos Chinese people are supposed to not have on their phones, and nobody would be able to find out that this was going on. So could, for that matter, the police in the UK or Australia or America or anywhere where they could serve warrants on Apple. And this means that you get very hard jurisdictional issues. Suppose, for example, that once COVID is over, I fly to China and I land in Shanghai and I pick up my iPhone. Does my iPhone now suddenly have to start using Chinese filterware? Does it have to report to the Ministry of State Security if I happen to have a picture of the Pope sitting in my camera roll? So this brings out a whole complete mess of difficult problems around technical security, privacy, and policy. So one of the things that we did as one paper that you might care to look at if you're interested in these kinds of policy issues is that I wrote a paper, Bugs in Our Pockets, the Risks of Client-Side Scanning, with a number of colleagues who include well-known cryptographers and computer security people. And the conclusion to which we came is that client-side scanning extends bulk surveillance from device communications to storage. Now, bulk wiretapping isn't allowed in the UK under the Investigatory Powers Act, although the authorities push the boundaries of that when they can. And so, just as we don't allow that, we shouldn't allow population-scale scanning of people's devices. This is going to make law-abiding citizens and whole societies more vulnerable. And at the same time, it's not going to guarantee more effective crime fighting because there are too many ways for the bad guys to get round it. So that's one more detailed example of the sort of technology policy questions that we end up wrestling with. And that particular issue, the Apple proposal for universal scanning of people's devices, was withdrawn by Apple. But governments are still pushing for some kind of client-side scanning as a countermeasure to end-to-end encryption, which we're all using more and more these days. And this tussle is going to go on and on and on. So to wrap up, lots of stuff fails because of conflicting incentives both within and between organizations. We discussed this in some micro-scale detail in the lecture on economics. As we come to look at governance, we see it happening at a national scale and indeed on an international scale. Governments do try and fix the problem, but governments have got mixed incentives of their own. In short, there's adversarial behavior all the way up and down the technology stack, and not just the technology stack, but the policy stack above it. And so we can expect a long, hard journey on tech governance, and that's exactly what happened with other industries before us. For example, motor cars came along in the 1880s, they scaled up in the 1920s, and yet they remained incredibly dangerous until the 1960s, when Ralph Nader wrote his book Unsafe at Any Speed, and suddenly this galvanized Congress and the public to action. Right, so it took basically 80 years, a human lifetime, to get the car industry under control, and even then it was not brought completely under control. Cars are still less safe than they could be, particularly in countries other than Europe, and the regulatory thing is pushed by companies when they can get away with it. So it's going to be a long, hard journey figuring out exactly how to regulate IT systems broadly defined, computers and communications, the new world that we're building, where we've got CPUs and communications in just about everything. And as we build these systems, it's really important to study the power dynamics, to understand who's using this system to do what to whom, who's exercising power over whom, what the flows of money are, how the regulation works, and what the various battles are that are going on behind the scenes. Because it's only if you understand the power dynamics that you'll know when you're fighting the right battle, that you'll know when you're building a product that isn't going to be shot down later by some kind of regulatory intervention. and you can be confident that you're doing something that's ethical and pushes the whole world in the right direction.